Welcome to the Innovation Show. This show is brought to you by the Kindle Institute, who have just dropped their first edition of their biannual journal. It features a collection of articles from some of the world's most forward-thinking executives, policymakers, and academics, designed to help business leaders gain actionable insights and perspectives around things like AI, global trade, and transformation. You can check out the journal and find out more about the Kindle Institute at www.kindle.com/institute. The list of leading companies that failed when confronted with disruptive changes in technology and market structure is a long one. At first glance, there seems to be no pattern in the changes that overtook them. In some cases, the new technology swept through quickly. In others, the transition took decades. In some, the new technologies were complex and expensive to develop. In others, the deadly technologies were simple extensions of what the leading companies already did better than anyone else. One theme common to all these failures, however, is that the decisions that led to the failure were made when the leaders in question were widely regarded as among the best companies in the world. There are two ways to resolve this paradox. One might be to conclude that firms such as Digital, IBM, Apple, Sears, Xerox, and Bucharest Erie must never have been well managed. Maybe they were successful because of good luck and fortuitous timing rather than good management. Maybe they finally fell on hard times because their fortune ran out. Maybe an alternative explanation, however, is that these failed firms were as well run as one could expect a firm managed by mortals to be, but that there is something about the way decisions get made in successful organizations that sows the seed of eventual failure. That is a quote from the classic Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, may he rest in peace. And it sets up exactly the conversation we want to have today. I'm joined by two gents that have graced the Innovation Show many, many times, friends of the show, friends of mine. It's a great pleasure to welcome first author of Cascades and Mapping Innovation, Greg Satell. Welcome to the stage.
Happy to be here, Aidan. Thanks for having me once again.
Always a pleasure. And friend of the show, author of Big Bang Disruption, Pivot for the Future, Jumping the S-Curve, and his little known but classic Mass Affluence that we're going to cover in the future. Paul Nunes, welcome back, my friend.
Thanks, Aidan. It's great to be here.
Great to have you back, man. Both of you guys are mass contributors to HBR as well. And you've written about the topic that I want to talk about today, which is that we can't learn from myths, but we can learn from the failures of companies. And so many of the case studies we read are actually myths. They're written from different perspectives that don't give an overall view. Greg, I'm going to come to you first because you have a perspective on this based on actually one of these case studies that was written about a company that you worked for.
Well, it was a company I ran in Kyiv, and we had about 800 employees, and it started off with a small business called the Kyiv Post, which eventually became a mature business and a relatively small part of our revenues, about 5%. But the researchers, they interviewed people mainly from that one business. So anybody reading that case study, which might have been effective as a teaching tool, would get would get a completely lopsided view of what was going on in the business and what we were really dealing with. And there's also a kind of a misaligned incentive for a researcher to find something that is really stark. You know, here's some huge company who made some huge mistake, and I can tell you how to do it better. You know, you're never going to build a consulting practice on, hey, you know, I went and I researched this business case, and actually the managers did a pretty good job with the challenges that they were confronted with. So where there's a huge incentive for somebody to say, hey, you know what? They got this one thing wrong and I can teach you how to get it right. And those silly people, they don't get it. But if you adopt my framework, my strategy, my whatever, you can avoid those pitfalls.
Paul, let's come to you. Let's build on that, what Greg set us up nicely for. So Greg has seen this perspective. You've also leaned into this perspective, studying companies as well. But one of the things you told us off air before we came online was a perspective prompted by this idea of what Clayton Christensen said, that it's very difficult to measure a moment in time, not only for a company and the configuration of that company, but for an industry itself.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here, Aiden, because, there's so many ways to go about trying to figure out something worth recognizing as an idea. And the whole thing of like, is this perfect advice or is this something management should think about? Two things I wanted to key off of what Greg said that I think were great. I mean, one is, are you talking to the right person? And one of the things, because, I actually headed up a think tank for Accenture that I always talk to our researchers about is, don't just talk to the CEO because they don't necessarily know anything about what you're talking about. So if you want good supply chain advice about, and it's a real case about a company that's really changing their supply chain, I want to hear what the head of supply chain has to say. It doesn't improve the story to hear what the CEO has to say, because often the CEO really has no idea except what the press has already told him or her about how that project became successful. So there's a real self-reinforcing loop to all of that. And then, I think it goes to this question of what kind of answers are you trying to get out? And so what I was mentioning to you before, Ian, was this, am I trying to get an answer of, oh, what's possible? What's something I might try? Or am I trying to find this universal postulate, this universal truth that always works? And that's fraught with a lot of danger. And we can talk about the industry components of that. Industry is a huge factor in understanding the value of any advice.
I think that's 100% true. And I think it's also another factor is how confusing life is, and the imprint that you put on it in retrospect. There's flaws in that as well. And this is something I really tried to convey in Cascades, where I was put in this, I've just found myself in this historic situation. And there was no great epiphany. There was no, oh, wow, this is, I've got it all figured out now. There was just a bunch of confusing things going on that I didn't really understand. And writing Cascades took me 15 years because it took me that long to make sense of it. And it really is that hard to gain an insight of actual importance. And there's lots and lots of ways to get it wrong and very few ways to get it right. And even if you're honest and you work really hard at it, and I'm sure Paul has had this experience as well, you still get a bunch of stuff wrong, which is why when you write a book, it needs to be fact checked. And when those fact checks come back, you make a lot of stupid mistakes. I made one in particular with Blockbuster CEO John Anioko, where I had been writing for years that he had gotten fired, when that wasn't true. And on some level, I knew it wasn't true, but for some reason, I got that into my head that he had been fired. And when I got on the phone with him to fact check, he said, well, first of all, I was never fired. I resigned. And as soon as he said it, I knew it was true. I have no idea how I got it in my head that he'd been fired. But I'll tell you what, I have seen that repeated a number of times by some very, very big names that everybody would recognize. And when I tracked down where they got that from, you know what I find? I was the source. They're referencing my article where I got it wrong. So you have to really be careful and don't believe everything you think.
I love that. I was actually thinking about the idea of the CEO telling the story. So one of the things that is a bugbear of mine is often, and this is no disrespect to the CEO, that the CEO gets invited to a conference and gets interviewed by an MC at the conference, and the CEO actually has no idea what happened down in the weeds of the organization to make an idea happen. And I was covering recently on the show with Robert Burgelman how Intel was actually directed towards microprocessors away from memory, from DRAM, only because people down in the middle of the organization actually decided that that was the right thing for the organization. And as Andy Grove himself, who was the CEO at the time, may he rest in peace, he said years later, it took them years at the top of the organization to say now the company was a microprocessor company, and how that was hijacked in a way by people who knew better down the organization. And it's that perpetuating of the myths that's the problem, that oftentimes the CEO doesn't even know how to articulate what had happened because they have so much on their plate. And I thought we discussed that because there's a little bit of empathy that has to go here with the story for the CEO as well. It's damn difficult to do this work.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I'm reminded of the advice to think about what part of the elephant you're touching, right? In order to figure out what you're actually seeing. And I think it's true that, did you get that story from the CEO? Did you get it from the chief marketing officer? Did you get it from the chief strategy officer? I mean, I did a lot of work with chief strategy officers who are always sort of a bit to the side of the full, C-suite thing. And the stories they can tell about, power struggles in the C-suite and stuff and how that influences that. You never see that from talking to the other people, the chief financial officer, the CEO. The CEO is not going to tell you about how, one real example, they didn't have enough international experience. So they constantly pushed the story that international expansion wasn't important because they just didn't want to do it. Not because strategically, it was like, and it was a product, it's a big name company and a big thing. It's like, well, the only way the product was going to be successful is if it became the global standard, not just the US standard. But the politics of who could actually turn it into and how are they going to turn it into a global standard, so who you talk to, how many you talk to, triangulating. And it's a great question of, have the people you're listening to, when they say they talked to somebody at a company and got this story, it's like, well, did they talk to somebody or did they triangulate it across 5 or 10 people from the C-suite? So that's always something we tried to do in our own research. And that is like, well, how many people have we talked to? I was fortunate to work for a large consulting firm where our teams were often in there doing a lot of work, talking to a large number of people. So it was a little easier to kind of triangulate stories. And, even our sources were kind of giving it to us from multiple angles. But yeah, a one and done interview is not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, and I can give a perspective being a former CEO. Typically, I mean, you don't get to make easy decisions, right? I mean, even in a relatively small business like ours, we still had 800 people. So when I made a decision, that was a decision that 799 other people could not make for one reason or another. And typically when you make those decisions, the context in which you make those decisions, you're surrounded by a number of people who are very bright, very, very capable, people who are in their positions because you trust them and you respect them. And they're all giving you different opinions. And they don't all agree. And you need to be the one who breaks that 50-50 tie. And you need to do this over and over and over again. And some of those decisions are going to be wrong. And any one of those decisions, roughly half of those people can say, "Oh, I thought we should take the other option." So this idea that you're gonna come back years later and somebody's gonna say, "Oh, they took path A when they could have taken path B," and oh, by the way, I know for some reason that was the decisive moment and not the decision they made 3 months before, 2 years later, or whatever it is.
And the problem of memory as well, I often think about that we have such faulty memories, and oftentimes you'll remember it differently. Just like you were saying, Greg, that you might perpetuate a flaw because, and then you put it into the lexicon of innovation, and then we suffer from the availability bias, where we lean onto the most recent information or the headline information. And I really want to talk about this because there's 3 case studies we're going to talk about today, which is the Netflix one, the Blockbuster Netflix one. Let's call it the Blockbuster one. There's Xerox and there's Kodak as well. And these, when I first started learning about innovation, the availability heuristic was these were all stupid decisions by stupid people. How could they be so silly to miss this type of thing? And I actually looked back over some literature on this. I'll link to different articles that you guys have written. But there was also one that Clayton Christensen wrote about Netflix because he didn't see Netflix being a big challenger to Blockbuster. So here's what he said. He said, the fact that disruption can take time helps to explain why incumbents frequently overlook disruptors. For example, when Netflix launched in 1997, its initial service was not appealing to most of Blockbuster's customers, who rented movies, typically new releases, on impulse. Netflix had an exclusively online interface and a large inventory of movies, but delivery through the US mail meant selections took several days to arrive. The service appealed to only a few customer groups: movie buffs who didn't care about new releases, early adopters of DVD players, and online shoppers. If Netflix had not eventually begun to serve a broader segment of the market, Blockbuster's decision to ignore this competitor would not have been a strategic blunder. The 2 companies filled very different needs for their different customers. So that's kind of out there. But actually, Netflix didn't, or Blockbuster did not ignore Netflix. And as you pointed to this, Greg, John Antioco went to great lengths to actually reverse this, but also saw that Blockbuster had more arrows in its quiver than Netflix had back then, and redirected lots of revenue towards a brand new product that was like Netflix on steroids at the time. I'd love you to give us a bit of context to this, and then we'll discuss this case and then move on to the others.
Well, I think there's a bunch of things. First of all, that CEO, John Antioco, and there was another CEO that came later that actually did ignore it. But let me just give you some additional pieces of context. First, Blockbuster started investing in streaming technology in 2000. So it wasn't like they weren't aware that the industry was changing. Unfortunately, the partner they chose for that venture was Enron, so it didn't last very long. There's that famous story that that's often told, that the Netflix people came to Blockbuster with a deal where they would sell Netflix for $50 million, and Antioco laughed them out of the room. There's a number of problems with that story. First of all, they didn't have the subscription model then. Second of all, they weren't making any money. Third of all, Blockbuster said, well, we could just build that ourselves for less than $50 million, which was true. And if they had bought them, Reed Hastings would have been gone within a year or two. The Netflix they might have never came up with the subscription model. And what they actually had proposed, because John Antioco wasn't in the room, he might have stopped by, but what they actually went there to propose was a deal very, very similar. And I'm sure it was modeled on the absolutely disastrous deal that Toys R Us signed with Amazon, where they went to Blockbuster and said, hey, you don't have an online business yet. We'll be your online brand, which is exactly what Toys R Us did. And it lost them years in their e-commerce business. The last bit of context there was that Blockbuster was owned by Viacom at the time. So they couldn't make all of their own decisions. And in fact, they had to delay their launching of their online business because they were in the process of being spun out by Viacom. So not only were they not ignoring the online business, they were actually chomping at the bit to start the online business. So I'll stop there and we can discuss the story more.
Paul, I'd love you to come in. I just wanted to share a little piece. So the co-founder of Netflix back then was a guy called Mark Randolph, and he wrote a book called That'll Never Work. And he shared the story. He said they were flat out rejected by John and Antioco at the time. And he said also that Antioco said Netflix was a niche business and the dot-com hysteria was completely overblown. So all these things perpetuate the stories and make out Antioco to be an idiot. But as you said, Greg, he went to great lengths and actually even got funding from the marketplace. And this is how they allowed in Carl Icahn to almost hijack it and oust him eventually, or make it uncomfortable for him to run the company in the end. And all these decisions, to the point that you made as a CEO, are coming at you. And then you have to make a decision that's a real paradigm shift for the organization. And it's easy to look back and go, as the Clayton Christensen piece said, these were dumb managers. They got it all wrong. But they were also leaders who ran very successful organizations very well for a very long period of time. Paul, I'd love you to come in there and share your perspective of what Greg said there and how you see it, how you've seen it through the lens of the work you've done over the decades.
Yeah, I think Greg has some great insights there, because it really is always far more complicated than, the sound bites from the media are going to give it to you. A couple things that occur to me is, one of the things we talk a lot about is the inevitable future, right? And those who've read sort of some of my stuff in the past with Big Bang Disruption, technology was changing, exponentially fast at the time. And the paradigms that the people that were of the leadership and their historical experience at the time was very different than even what we know now. So to judge those leaders, 20, 30 years on, in a world of Moore's law and exponential technology growth, is kind of unfair to all of those people, on the first level. So, and Reed Hastings was someone who really got that. We wrote an article about him as a sort of, three horizon leader. When you think about what happened with DVDs by mail, but then he jumped on online delivery, and then he jumped on using data as a source of intelligence for content creation. That vision of seeing how technology was going to reinvent that business along three horizons to the inevitable future of now, which is almost entirely custom programming for particular, profitable niche segments by the millions, is visionary. So I think there's really two parts to that as well. One is, do you get the vision right? And that's always impossible, hard or impossible. It's rare. But then the other thing that, Greg points out that's really important is the degrees of freedom. Like they were in the middle of a sale. They were owned by other companies. We never give enough credit, to the poor leadership of any case that we ever do about, how many degrees of freedom did they really have? One of my great co-authors, Tim Breen, who's can't be given enough credit for Accenture's success during his time as a leader and CSO, and just a profound leader, always recognized the conundrums, the two-sided one where neither answer, where the executive has to make the decision about a thing that has no good answer. I'll give you one quick example. Should we fire the entrepreneurs in the company? Well, if we're trying to scale a business, if I'm Starbucks, I don't need somebody who's coming to me every day saying, maybe the logo should be blue. Maybe the logo should be, maybe we should have bigger stores. Someone's like, no, I want you to take this store model and I want you to make 50,000 of them as fast as you can. Now, the most cost-effective way to do that is to get everybody off the boat who doesn't want to make 50,000 more of these and to hire people who know exactly how to make 50,000 of these fast and cost effectively. The problem is once you got 50,000 stores that are, bordering on obsolescence, now you want the entrepreneurs. Now you want big ideas, but you don't have them because you don't have those people anymore. So knowing who to fire when for what cost things, there's no easy right answer. But somebody's going to come back and say, well, it's your fault. You fired all of the entrepreneurial talent in the firm. Well, yeah, when we were making a lot of money with Six Sigma because we had none of that extra cost, then you loved me. Then I was Jack Welch. But when you get to the Immelt era and it's like, well, what's the next play, guys? What's the next game? How are you going to make money? Then all of a sudden, I'm the bad guy. So much of the context and, has to be brought in. And it's pretty tough beyond even just figuring out what the right answer is. Assigning blame to people really without really being deeply in it, that's really kind of a fool's game. And we see that again and again. So I'm very cautious. I may, see a mistake maybe, but to actually blame somebody for it, you better be pretty immersed in what's going on to take that next step.
Yeah. And very much to Paul's point, I think it's, you have to approach it with humility. Right. And that, I know Mark Randolph's and Rita Hastings' version of that meeting, but Anioko has a different version. He said he just stopped by and wasn't actually part of the discussions. And I have no reason to discount his part of the story, and lots of reasons to discount their part of the story, because that was the lowest of the lows for them. That was a highly, highly emotional meeting for them, where, a few minutes in his day for Anioko. But I also think you need to actually walk through exactly what they did do. So within 6 months of the announcement of the spinoff, they launched Blockbuster online. That's pretty fast because you're not just talking about a website, you're talking about logistics and everything else you need to set up the business. And then they took another 3 months to cancel late fees. And the reason why that took a little bit longer is they wanted to set up a couple of pilot tests to see what they were getting into, which most people would say is a pretty good idea, right? You want to know how your decisions are going to affect the business. So they did that, then that was successful. Now you're down to like 2005. In 2000, and then they started growing. In 2006, they launched a new business model called Total Access. And this essentially allowed customers to use the stores and the online interchangeably. This is something Netflix couldn't deliver, and took all that brick and mortar and transformed it from a liability to an asset, because now you could stop by the store and rent on your way home, and then just drop it in the mail to return it, or you could do the opposite. And that was and that, I believe, launched in November 2006. Now, immediately within that month, up to that point, I think it had been new subscribers 70-30 in Netflix's favor. Within that month of November, it flipped to 70-30 in Blockbuster's behavior. So now Blockbuster was winning. The problem was that Blockbuster had long been a cash cow and was just throwing off money, and these were expensive changes. And earnings took a hit. Well, shareholders really didn't like that, so the stock price took a hit, which didn't make the lead investor, Carl Icahn, very happy. He had gotten control of the board. So January comes, he tells Anioco, well, I'm not going to pay your bonus that I'm contractually obligated to pay. And what John said to me was, I was just in a place personally, professionally, financially, that I didn't need this shit anymore. So he says, listen, Carl, I'll stay for 6 months. You find another CEO. And then they brought in a guy named Jim Keyes, who actually did reverse all the changes Anioco had made. But the epilogue to the story is then Anioco went and built his own retail empire of Red Mango and other stores. So he's done, far from being an idiot, he's done quite well for himself.
That's the problem, isn't it? I just, there's so many viewpoints involved. And actually, I'm going to share on the screen a law called Miles' Law, named after the author and American bureaucrat, actually, a guy called Rufus Miles, that your view, where you stand depends on where you sit, essentially. And for those who are just listening to us on the screen here, it's just an image. I shared it before a few weeks ago with Joe Bauer. It's the head of sales saying we need more funds for marketing. It's the head of R&D said we should invest more in innovation. And it's the head of finance saying we need to cut costs. And it's not just that it depends on where you are in the company. It depends on, like Greg just said, where you are in your life cycle as a manager. If you're a leader like John Antioco, I just don't need this crap anymore. I'm out of it. So there's so many decisions that affect an actual decision. And to just label that as this frozen moment in time as idiocy is actually so wrong. And it's damning for innovation, and there's no learning from that. And Paul, maybe you want to come in on some of the stuff that Greg said there.
Yeah, at first, just to that great picture, I hadn't seen that Miles' Law thing, but it actually goes to some of the stuff that we thought about and looked at for a long time. But I would take it further. It's not just that you get those different opinions from those seats, but it's their job. It is the job of the different members of the C-suite to advocate for their point of view. It's the CFO's job to advocate for fiscal responsibility, and it's marketing's job to advocate for the customer, and so on and so on. And the key is it's the CEO's job to then control and blend and intelligently manage those things. But the thing is, I don't want my CFO worrying about the customer, really. That's the marketing, right? And the right thing is to get the right advocates for the right positions and to get the right blend. But that's exactly why you're going to get a very different story if you go to the marketing person, because they're going to see it a very different way. And they're going to say, like, they let the penny counting destroy the customer experience. Well, that's not the CFO's point of view, nor should it be, because the CFO's got to manage the pennies, because when those things get out of whack, that's when you blast the money and everything kind of goes wrong. What I heard from Greg that I thought was really interesting was this flip that actually happened, because I knew some other components that I've been told about the story. Because when you think about it, one of the things that, for those of us who are old enough to actually have used Blockbuster, one of the things was towards the end, it never had any of the content in place. And part of it was because they never wanted to print enough of the Blockbusters, because they kind of wanted you to rent movies you didn't want for a couple of weeks until you actually got in there when somebody had returned the Blockbusters, right? So giving everybody the Blockbuster the week it came out was actually not the best content delivery strategy. And in fact, if you look at it a bit more generically, and this isn't blaming Blockbuster, I don't even know the extent to which it's true, but if you think about it, it's designed, any kind of retail store is designed around a scarcity mentality. There's not endless shelf space. There's not. And so one of the big things that the internet did coming in was it had to shift business strategy and the mentality from a scarcity mentality and strategies to abundance mentality and strategies. Because now when you've got it coming out of one single warehouse with thousands and thousands of DVDs stacked up, That's abundance. When I can cut a new CD the moment I need it, when I've got video streaming, that's abundance. And I think, Aidan, you and I have talked a little bit about this, but the future of digital music, for example, just like any digital content, the future of digital content is like music, any song, anytime, anywhere. It's not about iTunes. It's not about owning my 10 favorite albums digitally. It's not about it, even the same for digital photos in some ways. All the photos, anytime, anywhere, all I want. It's an abundance mentality. So I can see some interesting, historical aspects of thinking about how did all those people who grew up in retail and in a scarcity mentality, who were looking to exploit scarcity and control the customer, how were they, to what extent were they prepared to really see? Again, it's a function of, do you see the future, and are you prepared to act on the future, and what are your constraints of acting on the future? And again, it's no criticism of, particularly without real knowledge, it's no criticism of what they knew of the future and what they were able to do. You just have to kind of see it as, some failure of both of those constraints.
One of the things, just to bring in, I'd love you to share your perspective on this one, was I spoke to Matt Christensen a few years ago, who's the son of Clayton Christensen, and he was talking about the innovator's dilemma. He knew a lot of people who were franchisees in Blockbuster. And he said for the franchisees, they didn't want to go digital because it meant pushing people away from the store. So there was a further complication there that you just didn't think of at the time. And then, so I'd love you to talk about that maybe. And then the other one was Jim Keyes, the guy who came in. So he was the CEO of 7-Eleven at the time, a retailer through and through. He was given a brief. So we can look at him and go, Keyes made the mistake. Keyes could have been told by ICANN, for all we know, I want you to come in and reverse all these decisions. Also, the late fees, like Greg said, he reversed the late fees. Now, he reversed it, but he was under probably pressure to do so, or under orders to do so as the new CEO coming in. Maybe he was put in there because he knew ICANN, and ICANN trusted him to put into place all these directives that he had done. So we've no idea about those things that happen behind closed doors.
I actually have some idea about that because I spoke at length with Jim Keyes as well. And the interesting thing is there, I don't think that Carl Icahn was pushing him. And very much to Paul's point, one of Anioko's key innovations and the way that Blockbuster became dominant in the industry is he switched from that scarcity mentality by fighting for those blockbuster movies to actually partnering with the studios. So the studios got a percentage of every rental. So now the studios wanted to give them the blockbusters and make sure they had them in store. Well, and this is such a good, and I don't know this for a fact because I never asked either of them about this, and I certainly didn't ask Jim Keyes. But what I do know for a fact is they both worked together at 7-Eleven. And that's where Anioko was a son of a milkman, and he worked up his way very, very quickly. And then he got headhunted out of 7-Eleven and then made a big turnaround at Circle K, which then led to another big turnaround at Taco Bell, which eventually, so he had built this reputation as this retail magician. And what is absolutely clear is that Anioko and Keyes did not like each other at all. And Anioko told ICANN not to hire Jim Keyes. So when Jim Keyes came in and said, Anioko's on his way out, and stockholders, and by the way, I did ask Anioko about the franchisees. He said it was an issue, but they only had about 20% of the stores. It was a problem because they created noise, and that that affected the stock price, but that it wasn't actually decisive. But the interesting thing is Jim Keyes came in and said, oh, by the way, this guy I used to work with and maybe had some rivalry with or whatever happened between them, everything he did was wrong and I'm going to reverse it all. And the fate of the entire company could have, it's not, it's within the bounds of possibility. The fate of the company might have been sealed by the fact those two guys didn't like each other. But what I think, and we should move on to some of the other stories, but what I think is so important about the Blockbuster story is if you listen to the conventional story, if you read Mark Randolph's book, you come away thinking, wow, these big fat cats, they just don't pay any attention. So if I pay attention, I'll be okay. When actually the lesson learned is that should be learned is if you make tough decisions, even if they're the right decisions, there is going to be consequences. And you need to make sure that you're not only making the right decisions, but telling that story, because it was the failure to tell the story of what he was doing and why he was doing it that probably sealed his fate. I don't know whether it would have turned out differently if he told the story better, but it was the falling stock price that caused that conflict that led him to leave, not a problem with the strategy. And that's a much, much tougher problem. And I'll just close with what John Antiochos said to me. And remember, here's a guy who had gone from company to company, pulling turnaround after turnaround. And he said, I learned throughout my career, whenever I tried to do something significant to make an impact, I got fierce resistance. And my entire career, I just pushed through it. And this time it didn't work.
I'm going to let that sit a moment because I think that's a great insight, and I really don't want to step on Greg's point there, because I think that's a great insight in the sense of sometimes it just doesn't work, and I think sometimes what used to work in the past doesn't work. One thing I can see here that I think is pretty interesting and something that doesn't get enough discussion about, it ties into all of the thoughts about strategy and strategy advice, which is what are we trying to do here? And if what we're trying to do here is make money, which is sort of the historical, we're all old enough to remember that, shareholder value is the key of all of it. Then it's like, all right, if it's all about shareholder value, and I'm not saying it is, not saying it is now, there's all the thing, but at the time there was a pretty dominant shareholder value mindset. Then it's about profitability, and profits come from milking the cash cow. So I'm glad that Greg brought up this whole cash cow idea because for those who are paying attention, and Aidan, you might remember that, part of the book Pivot to the Future is about the old logic, new logic. There is no cash cow. Technology moves things so fast that there really isn't this mentality of when can we take the pause and when can we milk the cash cow? But in the old days, you think about it, it's like, all right, we've got this investment, and every business has infrastructure, has some set of sunken costs, assets, and asset intensity. Whether it was 20% or more of franchisees, the point is you've got bricks and mortars, you've got the embedded infrastructure, you made investments in that, and I'm sorry, how are you going to milk that? You've got this model that's working, and how long are you going to milk that? And for, how much are you going to squeeze the last drops of milk out of that cow? And the other thing that I think technology at the time changed in ways that executives, maybe to make a generalization, weren't prepared for was the speed at which competitors and new entrants would be able to move in. So this window of opportunity. So you as an executive are struggling to manage the milking of the cash cow, the level of investment in the future that you're prepared to make, how that's going to be reacted to by these shareholders that are already down your throat because of declining margins. If you wait too long, It's the whole thing we talked about jumping the S curve. If you wait too long, you're already at the place where margins are declining. Now you got no money to invest in anything else because, so how are you going to do that? You're going to start to sell off what we see, right, Trish? You're going to start to sell off businesses to get the cash. Well, that only works so well, look at GE appliances, sort of thing. So how are you going to do that? So something to focus on and think about is this window of opportunity and the nature of how not only do companies have to get the decisions right, they have to get it right within the window of opportunity. And even if you have the right decision, as I think Blockbuster did for a lot of these, what they may not have duly incorporated was, that window's of switching over. Even though you were fast, and Greg was right, it's like 6 months is enormously fast for a company like Blockbuster to put on a DVD by mail business. Might not have been fast enough.
As you say, Paul, in Jumping the S-Curve, there's an S-curve of your capabilities as well that's waning in the background. And then you may have a new strategy, but have nobody in the company who's capable of achieving that strategy as well.
Exactly, which is, how did Blockbuster even have the people who could stand up a 6-month, stand up a business in DVD by mail in 6 months? That's pretty impressive from scratch. It's like, just do it. I mean, to have had some executive there, even if they were hiring consultants or external entrepreneurs, just to be able to stand up a business that fast is impressive leadership.
So let's segue to a different case study. One final thing I just want to say that, Greg, I just wanted to emphasize the controlling of the narrative that you mentioned there is so key. One of the greatest ones I've heard about, this greatest case studies I heard about, which controlled the narrative, was, I think it's Shantanu Narayan, who was the CEO of Adobe, who said, we're going to shift to the cloud. They were one of the first that went from selling essentially physical copies of software on discs, on DVD-ROMs, to move to the cloud, and said, you're going to see a dip in our software, but there's going to be a kicker down the line. But that was lucky for Adobe because it meant repetitive subscription-based models versus one-off sales of a product. One of the total different ones is something that you've talked about quite a lot, Greg, which is the case study of Kodak. And Kodak, and you worked in the shift from analog dollars to digital dimes. And Kodak had a little bit of this. And a couple of weeks ago, I talked to Gary Hamill on the show, and he said one of the big problems is when you shift to a new product like this, or a new paradigm shift to something digital, where the price is way less, is that for a bird in the hand, you need multiple birds in the bush. And it's very difficult to pull people away from their current revenue streams, like we just saw in the case study of Blockbuster. But Steve Sasson was a guy I had on the show. Steve Sasson was the guy who created the digital camera for Kodak within Kodak. And he was told, that's cute, don't tell anybody about it, which is a good line, as Greg says, but not completely accurate, because people inside Kodak did pay attention to this product. And Steve Sasson does say this himself, that some people in the company were positively paranoid about this and were trying to take action on it, but it just did not stack up. So, Greg, maybe you'll set up this case study for us.
Yeah, to be honest, this is one that I don't know. I haven't interviewed the principals, but I can give you the outline. I think it sets up that same dilemma. The problem wasn't that Kodak didn't want to create digital cameras. In fact, they had the top selling line of digital cameras. The problem was film developing was so enormously profitable, and they never were able to replace. Nobody's ever been able to replace those revenues ever. So, and that was, you went to your local Kodak place, and they would develop your film for you. It was almost, the business model was almost like the razor and the blades. They didn't make money selling you cameras. They didn't care what cameras you bought. If your camera was a Canon or a Nikon or whatever, you would go to Kodak to get the film developed. And nobody's been ever able to answer that question. How were they supposed to replace that revenue? And that, I think, is a much, much harder question. They probably would have been much, much better served if they never tried. Because to this day, nobody's really made a great business out of digital cameras.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I think, from my own perspective, when we talk about pivoting to the future, and we talk about sort of the three horizons, the old business, the now business, and the new business, you think about that from a Kodak perspective, it's this trying to find the synergies and blending. It's like, all right, you've got a film business, which is pretty distinct. You've got a camera, maybe in a digital business, and then you've got I said, the inevitable future of photography, which is essentially digital photography, which is really, consumers with millions of pictures. One of the things I can contribute that has always stayed with me is I did have the chance to talk to former head of marketing of Kodak, and it was the absolute head of marketing for Kodak. And one of the things that he said that stuck with me was that he said, towards the end, I knew it was over when the top executives all over the company weren't photographers. He said, when we started out, the CEO was going home to his darkroom to develop pictures. It's like, we loved photography. All of us loved photography and what it meant, and pictures and photos. It's like photography and photos. I think you said towards the end of it, it was, and I'm paraphrasing, and I don't want to impugn all sorts of things that, call it apocryphal if you want. But anyway, but this person pointed out, but it always stuck with me because he said, there was no way we were going to know that kids were going to take thousands of pictures on their phones and stuff and go for those little photos and everything else. He said, we just got, and of course the chief marketing officer would say this, but we just really got disconnected, not even just from the customer, but from what the nature of personal photography meant. It meant you could take, as you mentioned, I travel, thousands of pictures, when you go, and again, it goes from a scarcity to an abundance mentality in ways. It's like, if you recognize that what people don't want 12 photos or to 24 photos of their vacation. They want 1,200 pictures of their vacation. And then they want to, take the red eye out of it, instantly and make it look good so they can send it to their friends. So capturing that mentality, it wasn't just about, it's going to be digital and a digital camera. It was the fundamental revolution of what personal and even professional photography was going to mean. Do you really have a workforce top to bottom that's really ready for that kind of transition? And again, the timing question of at what point do we cannibalize our base business and move into the new? And the third thing, and I would just leave it with this, is the question of, did you really fail if you made a ton of money in your core business? Because one of the things we looked a lot at is, and I had this argument about high performance businesses, like, well, I never know if the business was successful or not, if it's still going, if it's still ongoing. Because I have no idea how much money they're going to throw away on the next business from the profits of the old business, trying to get to the new business, right? You look at, I don't want to name names, but you can think of some companies who've spent the entirety of the profits they made in a previous business trying to be successful on the next line, right? And it's like, well, was that business successful and then not successful, or was it never successful because in the end its net profit was zero? So we always have to think a bit about what was the goal, what was the profitability goals about that. And don't forget, Kodak was making billions of dollars, and we talk about that in part of our story of it, on licensing fees and lots of other stuff. So their technologies and that, to the end, years after Kodak was technically bankrupt, it was still making literally billions of dollars on licensing. So it had a shell company that was basically just handling the IP licensing. So it can be kind of complex in that. But like I say, I think some of the biggest question is, sometimes, do you have enough of the mentality across the business to see the old, the now, and the new in the future of what digital really meant for photography?
I also think this case is particularly interesting because we can look what their key competitor, Fuji, did, which was to get out of the photography business. They made a bunch of diversified bets into medical imaging, biopharmaceuticals. I think they had some cosmetics there. But it is interesting to look at that alternative reality and see what they made. Kodak actually tried to stay in photography, and I think that was probably their big mistake. But again, going back, it's it that was a very, very tough situation when you have an incredibly successful business throwing off a lot of cash. It's really easy to say, oh, they should have just walked away from all that, when actually I've never heard a really good answer of because obviously walking away from that cash, they would have run into the same problem that Anioko ran into with the stock price. And and any CEO who had the smarts and the guts to make that decision would have had the naysayers killing the stock price.
It's a perfect example of the trade-off between, scale and specialization and flexibility and resilience, right? And that was actually the truth of Fuji, in that Fuji, because it didn't have the scale of Kodak, actually had to find other uses for its chemical capabilities, its processes, and the use of outsourcers and, various other forms of flexibility. So Kodak was this perfect monolith, made perfectly efficient to its model, while Fuji had created degrees of freedom for itself and flexibility. So just some fascinating stuff when we looked at it. Greg brought up the point about why was it in beauty products? I have to share the story that it's the collagen. Collagen is the stuff that film is made out of, and it's susceptible to ultraviolet rays. Well, the other thing that's made of collagen is your skin, and it's susceptible to ultraviolet rays. So if you want a beauty cream that keeps the collagen despite UV rays, you've got a beauty product, and you want the chemicals that Fuji's make. But Fuji's mindset was always about, what else can I do? How can I repurpose my capabilities? Because Kodak was the 800-pound gorilla in the industry. But I think that also ties in nicely to this idea of, before you blame somebody too quickly, in the sense of, well, when they perfected the 800-pound gorilla model, that comes with a natural inflexibility. It's a conundrum. And like I said, I talked about Tim Breen because he talked to me about it all the time. He was like, Paul, how are we going to break some of these permanent trade-offs? Either I get the costs out to get the profitability, or I stay flexible. And either way, if I get it wrong, somebody's going to blame me.
Paul, one of the things we talked about before was target fixation. And I'd love you to tell our audience about this. But I came up recently in a chat with Robert Burgelman, again, talking about Intel, and that during Intel's second phase, when they went to microprocessors, that they had this ultra focus on microprocessors. And as you say, just like Henry Ford, that they create this behemoth that is doing one thing extremely well, this perfect output. And that makes it very difficult to be agile, to create smaller outputs. And you see this, for example, in a lot of manufacturing companies, that they have their lines perfected for their products that they're most successful at. But when they try and introduce then maybe a new line, maybe it's chocolate, and they want to put out a new flavor based on a new quirk in the industry, that they can't do it, despite people inside the company craving it, customers craving it. And it's the problem of target fixation.
Yeah, I can speak to that, and I love talking about it because it's actually part of an early experience of mine. Before some of the thought leadership that I did, I actually was part of and helped head up a group at Accenture that did technology future forecasting. So what was the future of various technologies? And in fact, Intel came to us one day with their P7 chip. And they said, guys, what we can do with this is you can get 8 video streams simultaneously off of this chip. This chip can drive 8 simultaneous video streams to your monitor at the same time. It's that powerful in one chip, and it'll fit on a desktop computer. What are the business applications? You guys are the business people. What? And so we looked and we thought, and we spent a couple of weeks with them, and they're like, there isn't anything really. We love you guys, but horse races, like sports, I want to watch 8 streams of basketball games maybe. And at the time, gaming, it's like, all right, gaming is really computing intensive and but we said, from business, I don't need my Excel spreadsheet. My Word document doesn't need 8 streams of video. What it needs is low power consumption and mobility. And they were like, huh. And so I don't want to, overplay what our involvement in Intel's pivot was, going back even one generation further, just to, portable processors. But it's that whole thing of mentality. And to your point, the target fixation, it's like, so long as we're the better, faster chip, we're going to stay in the lead. And they had the leap on Moore's law. And it wasn't a technology question. That fixation on, it's a technology question and a speed question, not a what's going on in the marketplace about the use of technology and processing power. That almost, caused them to completely miss the boat on that. And then they very quickly shift, and that's where we got the processors that could be used on cell phones and all the other stuff, and very fast microprocessors as opposed to general purpose chips.
And one of the things that Bergelman talked about, because he worked closely with Andy Grove, was that the fact that they turned on, they passed on the iPhone. They passed on the iPhone, creating chips for them, because they didn't understand the volume that they would have. These smaller chips for phones, but they didn't understand the volume. And the finance team got it wrong.
To build on some of the context of that, which is, you've got to remember, at the time, nobody can remember when the chip component, the general processor going into the PC, was $2,500 of the $3,200 delivered cost. Intel was making $2,500 off of every $3,200 PC that was being sold. So what incentive do they have to go to a $1,500 laptop, to go to a cheap chip, to go to a cell phone, to go to a $700 phone? Who's got $3,500 for a cell phone? So also the mental shift, and this is where the paradigm shift also occurred, which was really interesting, that we've never seen come back. And if you look back at it, there was a time where you didn't know how much the PC was going to cost, but you didn't know what kind of chip you were going to get, but you knew the PC was going to be $3,500. And that was kind of the magic price point. And we see this in lots of industries now and today. But this idea of then you latch on a price point, but then to bring it down to the $1,500 mark, it's usually a competitor. It's a new entrant that can reinvent the price point. Because the mentality, again, to sort of target fixation, one of your target fixations is historical price point. And which implies margins, implies revenues, implies everything. And if you can't break that, it's going to be pretty hard for you to invent the new business that replaces your old.
One last thing I'll just say on the Kodak thing that I learned along the way was that Kodak was such a legendary part of its environment, as in that people went there, they worked there, they were a family, they treated themselves like a family, everybody knew everybody else, they moved into the neighborhood, they were such a legendary part. And when then leadership had to make a decision to let people go because they didn't have the capabilities, or they had to redirect people like Fuji did, that they couldn't bring themselves to do it. So there was a huge psychological death and component at play here as well, that is often not recognized, that people are human. Like, there's human leaders. And if they're there from the original leadership team, like you said, Paul, a lot of them were photography people, that it's very, very difficult to redirect the organization because they've been imprinted in the way that it's always been.
Yeah, I can give some real life example of that because I was hired by IBM in 1982 as a co-op student from my university. And what was fascinating was at the time, IBM still had this idea of employment for life. So long as you didn't mess up, they were essentially promising you, more than essentially, a job for life. Now we think of that as a bit of a punchline, right? That some company would offer employment for life. But the key was there had been so many years and so many good years of jumping the S curve and of, moving on to the next thing. We were busy making PCs and PC juniors. Sure, IBM had missed the PC movement, but it was catching up. It eventually became, the dominant maker of those. And so this idea that the company would always, so long as the people stuck with us, the company would always move on to the next level was deeply ingrained. Now, what I cynically pointed out later, because I sort of made it a punchline of my own, which is that, employment for life lasts as long as a company can give it. The moment it means bankruptcy, employment for life goes away. And sometimes even sooner than that. So, never bet on on a guarantee of employment for life. Because it is, it's impossible to really honor. But there was that mentality. And again, sort of the thing that so long as your people grow with you, we're going to solve it.
So there's a nice segue for one of the most legendary stories in the history of technology, and that's the one of Xerox. And particularly if you take, for example, like Greg, you talked about in one of your Inc. articles, and I'm telling our audience here, I'm going to share all the articles the guys tip their hat to during this conversation as well. I'll share those in the show notes. But this is Steve Jobs and Xerox. So after the copier giant Xerox made an investment in Apple, it then gave the fledgling company Apple access, and Steve Jobs in particular, to the PARC, which was the Palo Alto Research Center PARC. And then he used that technology he saw there to create the Macintosh. That's the way the myth goes. But as Greg, you point out, what's missing from the story is that PARC delivered on its mission. And in fact, it saved Xerox from the fate of Kodak, because the copier business was disrupted by smaller Japanese competitors, Canon, Ricoh, many that we know today. One component of that was the Star system, the laser printer, replaced the revenues lost from the cash cow, and Xerox continued to grow. And it earned millions, like Kodak did, from licensing technology and IP that it invented. And we need to tell this story as well, because again, there's a book called Fumbling the Future that's about Xerox. Many people see Xerox as another one of these idiots, one of these fairy tales. And again, we need to distinguish the difference between mistakes and fairy tales.
Well, here, I think, is a little bit different because this wasn't a mistake. This was an enormous success. And I think the story of Xerox is interesting because it itself started off as a failure, where Chester Carlson, who invented the Xerox machine, couldn't sell it. And then I forget the name of the man he brought in as CEO. He said, okay, so we won't sell it, we'll lease it. And we'll charge companies per copy. And so they had and they never dreamed that they would copy so much. And it became enormously profitable. So the entire company was predicated on these huge copiers that could copy incredibly quickly. And back then, companies would have a copy room that you would go to, and the company, and that's what their customers were demanding. And then, of course, companies like Canon and Fuji came in with very, very cheap copiers that you could have in one office. So it wasn't better technology; it was just much, much cheaper. And it was a classic innovator's dilemma. So the CEO, Charles McCullen, said, we're an office company. What we need to do is reinvent the office. And we're going to build, and the future of the office is about the architecture of information. So we're going to go build a completely different unit called the Palo Alto Research Center to create this new world. And they did. Um, a- and there's two really great stories. One I'll tell now, one I'll tell a little bit later on. There was a guy named Charles, I think it wasn't Charles, it was Gary Starkweather. I interviewed him just a few years before he died in 2019. And he was an expert on optical lenses. And he apparently had invented something that made him unfireable, but he wanted to work on something else. And his boss said he wanted to work on lasers. And his boss said, that's not our business. And anybody who works with Gary on his stupid project, he's going to get fired. Nobody can work with him on it. And Gary, who's a mild-mannered, sweet guy, he gets so furious, he goes over his boss's head. And this wasn't done back then. This was 1968. And said, listen, I'm going to invent this here. I'm going to invent it somewhere else. So he goes to the vice president. And that was a fireable offense, normally. But McCullough had just created this Palo Alto Research Center. So instead of firing him, the VP said, well, let's send him out there. And then he created the laser printer, which paid for PARC many times over. And to Paul's point, they allowed the company to jump to the next S-curve. Along with that, they spun out a bunch of companies. Adobe, which you mentioned, was a 3Com, a bunch of others. The licensing fees, again, paid for PARC many times over. And by the way, they also had another strategy of investing in future technologies. And that is why Steve Jobs came to PARC. He wasn't some interloper because Xerox had that technology and because they were so forward-looking, they were able to invest in Apple before the IPO. So Steve Jobs didn't steal the Macintosh from them. Actually, Xerox made money on the Macintosh as well. So what's seen as some sort of failure was a forward-thinking leader who made a smart bet that really paid off.
There's a line, Paul, from Jumping the S-Curve where you say, so a little excerpt here, perhaps unfairly, companies like Kodak, Polaroid, DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, and Xerox via PARC have become poster children of sorts for businesses that fail to exploit technology opportunities that were seemingly within their grasp. No doubt these organizations made big blunders along the way, but they are far from unique. In Kodak's case, for example, the company identified digital possibilities relatively early, but continued to push the film and cameras that sustained its growth along the financial S-curve. Meanwhile, competitors went full bore into digital photography. Note that Kodak eventually became a major player in digital camera sales, ranking number 1 in the United States in 2005. Just to bring it all to a head, that you would recognize that as well. But most importantly, to echo what Greg just said, Xerox were far ahead. They were investing ahead of the curve. But again, the availability heuristic says they were failures, they were idiots, they were terrible decision makers.
Well, so what can I say? Wow, did I actually say that way back when? I have a perspective on this that came, I think, maybe from some additional research that we did after this time. But we did a lot of research on a topic that may be an important topic for future discussions and things, which is this idea of innovation management and innovation strategy. Because I think where there was the disconnect is that we learned later when we looked at innovation that innovation is a process at almost every business, right? That has to be managed, and you manage the innovation process. And the innovation process has some well-known, and those who study this and are experts at it, has some very well-known pieces that go from ideation to selection to, investment to testing, commercialization, all the way out to commercialization, right? And so one of the articles in a process we actually got a patent for was this idea of how do you assess and manage and improve the innovation process in a company? Because most large-scale successful businesses have successful innovation processes. What they usually get wrong is there's a bottleneck somewhere in there. So it's like, am I not generating enough ideas? Am I picking the wrong ideas to go forward with? Am I picking too many or too few? Am I investing enough in the testing, or am I, the scatter shot? How am I doing that? Am I taking too long or too slow to get it to the next checkpoint, right? The next critical step. Now, if you think of that and apply that to Xerox, the question would be, well, what was Xerox's innovation process? What was their innovation strategy? And when we looked at this, we came up with there's 13 generic strategies. You can find as many as you want. But when you think about it, we can be customer driven. Our strategy might be our innovations are going to be driven by what our customers want. There's a supplier. Some companies have supplier driven innovation strategies, which is when my suppliers give me better stuff that I can build into my product, like laminates for glass in automobiles or Gorilla Glass for cell phones. When I have better supplier supplies, I'm going to put that in. And then the way my product is going to improve is by supplier capabilities and by listening to suppliers and talking to my suppliers. Hey, can you make my glass better? Can you, the Johnson controls for a car? Can you integrate 3 or 4 of the parts so I don't have to assemble them later? Right. But there are all these different approaches to where you're going to get your strategy from. Now, if you look at Xerox again, you say, well, where were they getting their innovation from? And I think the thing is, to find some generalizable insight, if you're going to create this research park, you better be prepared to figure out how you're going to integrate that back into your core innovation strategy and core innovation process. Otherwise, it's just going to be on the side. Now, if you want to create insights on the side and sell those to other people as a new business model, maybe. But if you don't have your head around how the whole thing is supposed to work, it's like, how does this work? Then you're likely to see these things happen. You're going to see things slip away because it's not. And when we talk about it, I think there's 2 words that people can think about. It's directed research versus undirected research, which is, am I looking for laser printers? Am I saying research stuff, but only research stuff that makes copying better? And this is a slider, see, at companies and their innovation capabilities. And it's actually something we do talk about in Pivot to the Future, is that you can change your fundamental business model when you change how you think about some of these levers, directed versus undirected research. And then there's also centralized and decentralized, which Greg highlights nicely in what he was saying, is that, am I going to bring it all together like Walmart did in our example that said, we've got too much stuff going on, too many places. We're going to start to bring all this research together so people can see it, and so that we're not just like inventing little patches of things. New York Times did that as well when it tried to move online. It had too many little, $1 million initiatives that were bleeding it. And so, well, let's make one $10 million and let's let some group of person figure out how to better spend that money. So centralized versus decentralized innovation, directed versus undirected, getting that right, having that belief shared by management, because, Greg is talking fantastically about it. Management didn't agree at Xerox, it appears. Some of them were thinking, no, undirected, random kind of experiments, that can survive in this company, and that can be a good thing. While others are thinking, no, that's where you go out to pasture. The only research that matters is the research that drives our business. So a different way to think about it for Xerox, but also to exploit it for our own thinking and for, individual other companies. How are you thinking about your innovation process?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I do think it's interesting. The reason why why Steve Jobs was there is because Xerox understood that there was a consumer business building, and they understood that they had no tools to create consumer products. They were a business-to-business company. And that's why they invested in Apple. That was their investment in the consumer business. And also, very much to Paul's point, when they showed their computer of the future, the Alto, when they went down and showed it at their big Xerox festival or Xerox conferences, the executives, they didn't see the big deal, but their wives were transfixed on this Alto because, and it's really interesting because their wives, many of them had been secretaries before they had gotten married. This is back in the 70s, right? And they said, wow, this is incredible. But the big executives back then, they never wrote their own letters. They didn't see that as a manager's task. But I want to go back to the story of Gary Starkweather because I think it's such a wonderful story, and it interlocks with another story that shows how difficult this stuff is. So Gary's work had no relevance to what they were doing at the main research lab in Rochester. The reason why he ended up being so successful at PARC was they had invented bit mapping technology. And there was all the famous people there like Robert Taylor and Alan Kay and all these people who are legends now. But they were sitting with this software, this bit mapping technology that they couldn't use. And here comes Gary with a prototype laser printer that all of a sudden could use this bit mapping technology and put it into the real world and make real physical artifacts with it. And it immediately made sense to them that here was something that they could take the computer graphics and actually bring it into the physical world. Now, while they were doing that, there was a couple other guys at PARC, a guy named Dick Shoup and Alvy Ray Smith, and they were working on another digital graphics technology called SuperPaint, which was not at all popular within Xerox PARC because the mission of Xerox PARC was to create the office of the future, and SuperPaint had no relevance to that mission. So all of a sudden, Gary became, in that context, the establishment guy, and these two were ostracized because they were seen as irrelevant. So very much like Gary, they left. And Alvy Ray Smith went and teamed up with a friend of his named Ed Catmull and created the company we know today as Pixar. So what's successful and relevant and good in one context is often not going to be successful and good and relevant in a very different context. And when you're a leader, your job is to create a culture, a specific culture that's going to be able to do some things well and other things not so well. And those are the choices it's your responsibility to make as a leader.
I had loads more questions for the guys. We could have gone all day, as you can see. We probably will do another one. I think we'll do another one. We'll probably pick some more case studies as well that often are these myths, and we can learn more from mistakes than we can from fairy tales, as Greg says. Greg, for people who want to find you or find out what you're working on, what's your latest project and where can they find you?
Well, you can always find me on LinkedIn. My blog is digitaltonto.com. If you want to work with me, go to gregsatell.com. But what I'm working on now is a really exciting project I'm working on with Amy Radin. And, we hear so much about how leaders need to get out to the edges. But another strategy is to empower the edges to get noticed. So what we're working on is what we're building, and we're starting to work with a few clients on is a training for emerging leaders to help them advocate for their ideas more effectively and build their own influence. So instead of putting everything on the leaders to find what's going on at the edges, let's go to the edges and empower them to get their ideas heard. So that's something I'm really excited about.
Paul, you've been traveling to all the edges of the planet at the moment, but apart from that, you're also doing some guest lecturing, some keynotes as well.
Yeah, what I'm finding is that, as much as you think you've given a lot of talks or tried to get the word out there, that there are parts of the world that haven't actually heard the Pivot to the Future story and are starting to really appreciate it. So, surprisingly, in some ways, years on from its original pub date, I'm still finding that there are a lot of people really interested and really excited about this Pivot to the Future concept. There's obviously our discussions that people can go to, and lots of ways to pursue it if people are interested. I'm reachable always on LinkedIn. Always glad to talk to folks. I still do some presenting, some classroom teaching, and various other things because, old thought leaders never die, I guess. Just they just become a little more scarce, maybe.
Like fine wine, Paul, like fine wine. And the thing is, I have to say, is the biggest difficulty for me is when you look back on all these cases you talked about, is the empathy I have for leaders. I mean, very few of them just made poor decisions. There's so much in the head of a leader, and I love making this content accessible, and I'm very grateful to both of you for doing that and demystifying some of the myths that are out there, making the availability heuristics, exposing them for what they are as well. So it's a great pleasure to have you on this episode of Innovation Show X. Greg Satell, Paul Nunes, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan.
Thanks for having us.
This show is brought to you by the Kindle Institute, who have just dropped their first edition of their biannual journal. It features a collection of articles from some of the world's most forward-thinking executives, policymakers, and academics, designed to help business leaders gain actionable insights and perspectives around things like AI, global trade, and transformation. You can check out the journal and find out more about the Kindle Institute at www.kindle.com/institute.